Hello. I'm sure some of you will have a Facebook account, and you may have seen posts which contain images of human remains on your newsfeed, whether you wanted to or not. I was troubled by the number of these posts appearing on my own newsfeed in the last few years. Photos of dead children, Holocaust victims, plague burial pits, and every other variation of a deceased person you could think of. I wanted to investigate who was using these pictures, why, and how the public was reacting to them, by using content analysis research for 100 images on Facebook. Archaeologists and museums are using Facebook to share their research projects and promote their exhibits, sometimes including photos of human remains in their posts. Social media can be a powerful and useful tool to share research and promote events, but using images of human remains does pose some risk. Despite stringent guidelines in place for institutions handling, curating and displaying physical human remains, the specific issue of sharing images of them online is at best briefly mentioned, but more often than not, omitted entirely. Images are beyond the scope of the Human Tissue Act, but the British Association for Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology does recommend not to share images where the circumstances of death are particularly sensitive, such as genocide. The guidance for the care of human remains in museums explicitly mentions the photography of remains for educational and general museum use, suggesting institutions consider the views of cultural communities and genealogical descendants, but it doesn't mention sharing the images in the public domain. Facebook itself has limited guidelines which asks users not to post images containing specific elements such as visible internal organs. They then go on to say other images may be too graphic to appear on news feeds without being covered, but are allowed to be posted, including violent death and torture. This does not stop the images being shared on the platform, but covers them with a blurred panel which the user has to click to see the image, as seen here. My research found these guidelines to be applied inconsistently, with only 11 of the 100 images covered, despite many more meeting the criteria given. To investigate, I created a new profile and then liked and followed pages appropriate for the research. All of the images and text analysed could be seen on the primary level of the profile's newsfeed, with no effort needed to seek them out. Pages to like were selected based on the likelihood of featuring human remains, which were grouped into 6 categories. So pages operated by a specific museum which had human remains in their collection, pages for those with a general interest in history, archaeology-specific pages often operated by commercial units, pages with a history or archaeology-based humour, those operated by general news agencies, and those which promoted interesting stories. Now, this last category included pages which used synonyms of the words morbid, interesting, strange, weird, curious or macabre in their title or page description. I captured 100 posts from across these pages and analysed 3 elements: the image itself and the nature of the remains shown, the language used in the original post, and then the comments made in response to the post. Once images are uploaded to a digital public platform, they are open to being shared and commented on by the online community. Of course, resharing posts as they are intended to spread the word about events and increase audience for distributing research is a great thing about using social media. But there's a risk that the image can be taken out of context and reused for a completely different purpose. One such reuse is the creation of memes, a picture with minimal text for comedic effect. I found these were more likely to use ancient or skeletal remains, like Norman, my plastic skeleton shown here. For example, one meme showed multiple skeletons with their wrists bound and the caption YMCA. In this case, the original photo had been lifted from an archaeology news page, originally attached to an informative piece of writing about a mass grave. Within my sample of 100 images, 13 were memes, all reusing photographs from other sources. Particularly concerning was one designed to poke fun at archaeology, depicting a mass grave with an archaeologist popping a champagne cork over it. The image was in fact made up of several component photos, some from archaeology sites and others from construction equipment adverts and other sources to match the soil and pit. All of these memes came from pages which categorised themselves as humorous pages with an archaeology theme. Reactions to these memes were positive or humorous, with no negative reactions recorded at all, suggesting that the meme creators and their audience may primarily view the joke with no consideration for the original context of the image shown. The research found a range of intended purposes for posting images of human remains through analysis of the accompanying text. Some were promotional, encouraging visitors to visit sites or museums. Some were informative, using scientific and factual language, while others used sensationalist language to entertain and appeal to morbid curiosity. Reused images focused on the grotesque elements of the narrative on strange or interesting story pages, such as describing a bog body as having a facial expression of sheer pain. Clear patterns of language use and intended purpose emerged across the page types, highlighted by comparing two images of infants with medical conditions, which were both physically displayed in the same museum, one post on the museum's page itself and another on an interesting story page. The language used by the museum, where the remains shown as skeletal, was informative, with scientific reference to the condition the children had. Responses to this post were exclusively positive, including "such remarkable imagery, hauntingly beautiful." In contrast, the interesting story page appeared to promote the museum by claiming it masters the macabre. The infants in this image were preserved as wet specimens, attracting memes and both positive and negative comments in response, including "I love weird things in jars." An Incan teenage mummy posted to a history page varied between humanising and disapproving comments, such as "this young girl is the genuine sleeping beauty, so terribly sad to see her hair like this," and objectified "wow, where do they have it?" She is pictured in a laboratory surrounded by PPE-clad researchers, so although the image portrays her factually and scientifically, perhaps this instigates her objectification by commenters. It doesn't promote her dignity, and although she may have been treated with care by the researchers, sharing the image of the scientific process was divisive. The research found juvenile remains to be particularly emotive, with 90% of these posts receiving negative comments compared to 46% showing adult remains. Despite taboo subjects being used for comedic effect, unspoken boundaries for what is appropriate did appear to be intrinsically in place, with no juvenile remains used as memes, and 40% of posts attracting humorous comments compared to 58% for adult remains. Chronological proximity was another feature of the images analysed, with remains categorised as ancient, historic and modern. Within the current research, 22 images featured modern remains, 7 of which were forensic-related images and 8 depicting war victims. All 11 photos which were covered were within the modern category, despite equally graphic images occurring within the historic category, suggesting Facebook's covered image function appeared to consider older remains less likely to offend. Modern remains were much more likely to attract negative comments, with only 27% of posts featuring ancient remains receiving negative comments, compared to 57% showing historic remains and 79% containing modern remains. These comments were particularly impassioned when responding to difficult images, such as a post depicting multiple clothed corpses recently buried and exhumed following the 1940 Katyn massacre. One comment read, "This isn't interesting, it's sick. You do know you're giving people PTSD, right? Like we need to be presented with this expletive." With no positive reactions to the post recorded at all. The post featured on an interesting story page, and while the language used was not overtly sensationalist, the poster could be accused of consciously choosing a short quote from a witness testimony which was focused on the most horrific elements of the Katyn narrative. This depiction of multiple modern individuals in such a sensitive context raises the question of permission to freely share and use it as clickbait, with an invitation to see more pictures from this horrific event. Although faces are not identifiable, existing family members may be aware of the inclusion of their ancestors in the massacre and disagree with the circulation of the images in the style of infotainment. The state of decay of the remains also affected attitudes towards them. Only 10% of posts with skeletal remains use sensationalist language, compared to 49% of those with soft tissue. This reflected the fact that skeletal remains were predominantly found on archaeological pages. Where skeletal remains did appear on interesting story pages, they featured more sensational narratives, such as a mass grave or a skeleton with pathological deformities. Posts with images including soft tissue were consistently more likely to attract both positive and negative comments. Perhaps they featured more provocative narratives which inspired debate. It's been suggested that the public no longer finds traditional reporting of information compelling, and therefore infotainment has emerged to keep audiences engaged across all forms of media. The posts in the current research from both the interesting story pages and the history pages certainly met this description. They could educate and inform, but with flourishes of language that ensured they prioritised entertainment and provocation. For example, a post made to a history page of John Torrington of the 1845 Franklin expedition featured a close-up image of his partially decomposed face and a brief text describing a mystery that ended in starvation and cannibalism. 3 comments discussed the image not being covered by Facebook, with one stating that viewer discretion advised. Both positive and negative comments were made, with some revering the post as a fascinating piece of history. For those with soft tissue, positive comments tended to be humanising, such as "she seems to be at peace, lovely woman," in response to a Chinese mummy, rather than expressing enjoyment, such as "so cool," towards multiple skeletons in a plague pit. Negative comments towards skeletal remains tended to berate archaeological practice, such as "let them rest in peace," rather than revulsion at the remains themselves. Skeletons appear to be less interesting to the general public, but more relevant to those specifically interested in archaeology. Images of skeletal remains receive fewer comments of any type than those with soft tissue. Positive and negative comments were recorded for 56% of remains with soft tissue, compared with just 35% of skeletal remains, perhaps reflecting a more casual attitude towards skeletons influenced by the commonplace status of skulls and bones in popular culture. Museums are increasingly aware of the need to protect visitors from inadvertently viewing human remains. Some institutions do this through the layout of the exhibit, requiring guests to make an informed choice to follow the route leading to the remains, as shown here with the path leading to the Star exhibit. I recently visited the Hospital in the Rock Nuclear Bunker Museum in Budapest, which exhibits images of human remains from Hiroshima, but also uses architecture to censor them, with visitors having to make a deliberate effort to peep through an eye hole in a wall which cover the images in order to access them. And yet I was faced with very similar images on my Facebook newsfeed over my morning coffee. The distress caused by inadvertently viewing images on their newsfeed was specifically mentioned in response to 7 posts in my research. The physical environment housing human remains at some museums is also designed to evoke a sense of respect and reflection, with the power to compel most visitors to speak in quiet voices, if at all. While incidents of disrespect do occur, comments seen in my research are unlikely to be openly made if the bodies were viewed in a physical museum display where codes of conduct and social etiquette protect the dead person and the audience visiting them. The factors affecting the morality and inhibition of online communication have been widely explored. Anonymity, internet-based interactions not being seen as real life, security in a like-minded group, and a lack of authority could all contribute to users making comments they perhaps would not if faced with the remains or images in a physical setting. Equally, the interest in the macabre side of human life and the desensitisation to mortality suggested in numerous studies could also contribute to the posts and comments witnessed in my research. So, what can archaeologists and curators do to reduce the risk of their images being reused or vulnerable to tasteless comments? Firstly, leading by example to make sure the fundamental guidelines already in place for dealing with physical human remains are applied to images of them too. So treating them with respect, maintaining the dignity of the individual, and making sure their use is justified and not gratuitous. Secondly, watermarking images and using copyright statements can be used as a deterrent. It also demonstrates that professionals are being diligent in trying to protect their images. And finally, not using images of human remains directly on a Facebook newsfeed so that people can't come across them inadvertently. So making sure they're in galleries with a content warning and needing to click to be able to view them. There is a fine line between attracting new audiences and making archaeology interesting through the human remains we research, and using these remains superfluously to appeal to those who find them cool with or without a scientific narrative. The archaeology sector should be cautious that they maintain their ethical standards in all arenas, including social media, and we must remember that no matter how old or how decayed, every image of human remains represents a real person and must be treated with respect. Thank you.